Now everybody gather round and listen if you would. When I tell you every person needs a way of feeling good. Every kitty needs a ball of string and every dog a stick. But all you need is a bag of weed to really get a kick.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. A bag of weed, a bag of weed. Oh, everything is better with a bag of weed. It's the only help that you'll ever need, because everything is better with a bag of weed.
There you go, you're all getting it now.
When Texas people want to feel good,
They go assault a queer.
when stupid people need a thrill,
They rent the Rocketeer.
when Michael Jackson needs a rush.
He humps a guy like me.
But all we need is a bag of weed to keep us worry-free. 1, 2, 3, oh! A bag of weed, a bag of weed. Oh, everything is better with a bag of weed. No, you don't need meth and you don't need speed, because everything is better with a bag of weed.
Have a go, Brian. As Mr. H.L. Mencken said, the common man's a fool. And just like Helen Keller said, "Tuf tuki people cool." But try and use your heads and don't buy into all the fear.
Cause all we need is a bag of weed to make us wanna cheer. And 1, 2, a bag of weed, a bag of weed. Oh, everything is better with a bag of weed. You can try and fight, but we're all agreed, because everything is better with a bag of weed.